In this slide presentation, I want to give an overview of some of the issues around and characteristics of monuments and memorials. The tomb was the original monument, certainly in the Western world, created to perpetuate ancestral worship and unite the community of the dead, the living, and those yet to be born. The term enters English in the Middle Ages, from the Middle English monument denoting a burial place, via the French, and from the Latin monumentum and the Latin verb monerere, which means to remind. The word monerere, to call to mind, remind, advise, and warn, plus the suffix ment, is the same that we see in words ranging from abandonment to wonderment, words such as monitor, monster, monstrum, sign, omen, or object of dread, and premonition, as well as admonish and demonstrate. So a monument is a reminder. It is a presence, a trace, but also in some ways meant to warn, instruct, call to mind, or even inspire wonder or awe. The word monument first enters English in the early 1300s, meaning tomb, so a commemoration of the deceased, like a funeral monument. Not long after, around 1400, we find the record of monument in its more familiar use as a statue or building that memorializes or commemorates a notable person or event. The ancient tomb's function was not strictly commemorative, there being no Latin cognate for the modern word memorial, but understood as an element of the built environment. That is because a monument is always about presence. In the contemporary world, monuments and memorials are often conflated with one another, and they unite both the idea of memorialization, memory and mourning, as well as commemoration, understanding, and remembrance. And the spatial realization of presence in the monument is intended to embody the most general ideas of a time, or to perpetuate the memory of an eminent person or an important event above all. Monuments strive to express lofty ideals, and its size, style, and construction are meant to be a kind of visual and spatial language of majesty. And we certainly see that at work in these examples of monuments in India, as well as in West Africa. A monument is a dimensionally oriented artifact that can be primarily architectural or figurative in nature. The monuments that we see from around the world are often large in size. That is, they are monumental. They take up space and usually predominantly larger than the surrounding landscape, as you can see in all of the cases of these monuments here. These monuments here rely on scale that is large as well as heroic and romantic imagery. These are both from West Africa. The one on the left is Madame Tinubu from Tinubu Square in Lagos, Nigeria, and the one on the right marks 50 years of Senegalese independence in Dakar. Many monuments rely on a repertoire of architectural and visual forms that are very familiar to us: temples, statues, arches, shrines, and obelisks. Contemporary monuments sometimes deviate from these forms and are more abstract, embodying both modern architectural sensibilities, and we'll see some of those later. The idea of monuments in the Western world really has its origins first in ancient Egypt and then in ancient Greece. The ancient Greeks taking their inspiration from Egyptian statuary and tombs in the creation of their temples. In the Greek example, we can see that whether it's the case of Athena in the Parthenon or Zeus in the temple at Olympia, this combination of monumental architecture and then large-scale statuary embodying the personage for whom the memorial is dedicated is a formula that we see repeated throughout the Western world. What makes a sculpture monumental is usually its physically enlarged and vividly characterized nature. which conveys a powerful sense of the physical presence of the person depicted. Above all, monumental structures and sculptures inspire reverence. A monument is not only spatial but dimensional. It occupies space, but it also acts on its environment at a perceptual level, because often it's so very large or so stylistically differentiated from its environment that it stands out. It is kind of a hyper symbolic, hyper stylized structure. In the context of the United States, we see a similar repertoire of images and symbols and forms in the commemorative landscape. We see a lot of the same classic arches, temples, obelisks, and so forth, as well as more modern or abstract structures. If we take a look at some of the kinds of figures who are memorialized in monuments and statues and the form that these take, we can see several common features. First of all, like all monuments, they're literally cast in bronze or carved in stone. They're not meant to be impermanent. They're not meant to change. They're a solid, unchanging embodiment of some larger ideal. The first person memorialized in this fashion in the United States was George Washington. And in addition to the very famous one in Washington, D.C., there are numerous monuments all over the country, as well as commemorative statues depicting Washington. In many of these cases, Washington is seen as the heroic general on his horse, or standing or posing as if he's surveying the battlefield, as in these images. Or he's depicted as a Republican statesman in the classic sense, standing next to a Masonic pillar or Ionic column. And this gets taken even further in statues such as this one in the center, where Washington is now the classical Greek or Roman ideal statesman. These were all part of the founding mythology of the United States and the way in which Washington became the figurehead for the new republic in this way. Other images of the founding fathers in statuary and monuments, Franklin, Jefferson, Hamilton, again, portrayed in bronze or stone, in classical standing positions, again, sometimes with Republican imagery and Greek columns. Here on the right, we have the Jefferson Memorial, in which Jefferson, like Athena in the Parthenon, a classical bronze, standing in the center of the Greek-style temple. Another quality of monuments, as I mentioned, is this tendency to be heroic or ideal in nature. And this can be controversial when our changing ideas of American history and what constitutes appropriate or meaningful narrative change. And then we have to sort of rethink, who are we casting in bronze and stone in this way? Here we have a set of statues devoted to figures who are associated with colonial and pioneer history. Lewis and Clark down in the lower left, Brigham Young in the upper left, as well as Jesuit missionaries in California and Spanish conquistadors. In these cases, the frontier history of the United States, or the colonial history, is embodied in the heroic figures of colonizers who dominate prostrate Native Americans. There are similarities to statuary such as Lincoln and the emancipated slave kneeling at his feet, which you'll see in the Civil War Monument slideshow, and the statue of Theodore Roosevelt outside the National Museum of American History, where Roosevelt leads a charge on his horse with an African and Native American trailing behind him. More recently, statuary of the monumental sort has been created to celebrate alternative figures in American history. In the case of Native Americans, we have the Mount Rushmore-style carving of Crazy Horse in the upper right-hand corner, as well as the site of Little Bighorn, and this massive figure of a Native American woman, again, an idealized monumental figure, all located in South Dakota and memorializing the Plains Indian culture. African American history has its own set of heroes depicted increasingly as memorial or monumental statues. Here we have Harriet Tubman, George Washington Carver, Frederick Douglass, Mary McLeod Bethune. And these statues, you see that they're all relatively recent and portray established heroes of Black history. And increasingly also we have statuary devoted to the civil rights struggle, including these depicting the Little Rock Nine and the Greensboro Four, as well as the statue to the left, which is located in Birmingham, Alabama. In these cases, statuary attempts to depict those who have been left out or victimized in history as heroic in their own right. Sometimes they're figurative, sometimes even fairly literal, as in the case of this one at the left, illustrating the struggle that individuals went through or the kind of classical nature of their stoicism and ability to transcend their subjugation. All of these patterns emerge when we look at the quintessential African American hero who's been memorialized around the country, Martin Luther King Jr. Often Dr. King is depicted in either his pastor's robes or in a suit, orating, standing again in a heroic or visionary fashion. Often we see Martin Luther King looking off out into the distance, kind of like Washington did, borrowing on the iconography of early American heroes, but without the accoutrement of military or statecraft. Another thing that's interesting about Martin Luther King is the way in which the variety of ways in which he's been depicted not only as a person, but also as a set of ideas. So here we have a set of commemorative statues which depict his ideas, specifically his I Have a Dream speech. And finally, we have King, the monumental figure, like Washington. In a Mount Rushmore style, here we have him here in the King Memorial in Washington, D.C., literally carved into the stone, looming over and gazing out over the tidal basin in Washington, of equal grandeur with the Washington Monument and the other memorials there. Because they are often cast in bronze or stone, and because they represent idealized or unchanging or universal values, statues can be a site of great controversy as well. One of the issues that we are facing now as memorials come down is what should take their place. One interesting example is of this women's rights pioneer statue that's now located in Central Park, the only statue of women located there. The original design on the left depicted Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton conferring together. A critique of that design pointed out that the statue erased the contributions of Black women to the suffrage movement. And so a later design, depicted on the right, was created, which includes Sojourner Truth with Anthony and Stanton. This is the statue that has now been installed in the park, but it itself has also been considered controversial, and critiques have mounted that it implies that Black and white women worked as equal partners, collaborating and conferring in the movement, which historically was in fact not the case. So even inclusion can be accompanied by controversy if power is not addressed. Finally, I want to end with a more contemporary and modern trend in monuments and memorials. These structures are intended not to idealize or to valorize, but rather to memorialize, specifically those who were victims of historic trauma or other tragic events. Most prominent among these are the variety of Holocaust memorials and monuments throughout Europe and the world. We have depicted monuments. The bottom left-hand corner is from Dachau. On the bottom right, we have the Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe in Berlin, a memorial at Bergen-Belsen, the shoes along the Danube River in Budapest, the Kindertransport Memorial in London, and a memorial for the victims of a former Nazi concentration subcamp in Schwerte, Western Germany, which is the heads that are along the railroad track. It goes without saying, of course, that these are all memorials to those victimized by the Holocaust, that we find no monuments to Nazism in modern-day Germany. Perhaps the architectural remnants of the Reich, but no idealized or heroic representations. There are no statues of Hitler, right? The same way that we have statues and monuments to colonizers or enslavers in Europe and the United States. In the United States, the paradigm shift in monuments and memorialization in this more modern style happened with the creation of the National Vietnam Veterans Memorial, which was dedicated in the 1980s. This structure was designed by architect Maya Lin and was intended to represent not a heroic experience, which we saw in prior representations of military service, not a hero that would rise up above the earth in the traditional fashion, but rather a gash, a cut, a wound in the earth, as she put it, to suggest the suffering of the nation and especially those who served during this controversial conflict. This cut in the earth is adorned with the names of military personnel who were killed during the conflict. When this memorial was unveiled, it was actually quite controversial, and veterans groups insisted that the additional statuary depicted on the left of the three soldiers in a more traditional style also be included next to the marble slabs. Today, of course, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial has become iconic and is visited by thousands of people all over the world who come to pay tribute in various ways. Now, the stark, figurative, abstract, or modern architecture of the memorial is much more acceptable and much more common in the United States. A kind of architecture of tragedy, if you will, was also used in creating the 9/11 Monument and Memorial in New York City to represent the loss of the World Trade Towers and the loss of life from those attacks on 9/11. 9/11 memorials, like World War II or Confederate memorials, are one of the structures that have been scattered and perpetuated across the American landscape. So you'll find across the country various creative ways in which the tragedy of 9/11 has been represented as a public monument. So in the upper right-hand corner, we have, of course, the memorial in New York City. But the other images on this slide represent different memorials from around the country. Often these monuments are located in a downtown area or a city square, and many of them are literally constructed from pieces of the gridiron beams from the original trade tower structures. Some of these resemble a cross or are integrated as part of a sculpture, or even in one case here, paying tribute to the rescue dogs who helped recover remains in the ashes. For the most part, 9/11 memorials have eschewed a more heroic or traditional iconography, with a few exceptions, one being this one here in the upper left-hand corner of firefighters and first responders, echoing the iconic image of the first responders raising the flag at Ground Zero, which itself mimicked another iconic, heroic image of Iwo Jima from World War II. Finally, to continue this sense of modern approach to monumentalizing dark history, we have the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Alabama, an abstract representation honoring and marking the victims of lynching and mass incarceration. And here at this site, we see a predominantly very moving and powerful modern approach, along with the incorporation of some more traditional techniques such as statuary.